Hello, everyone. I think we're going to begin. So my name is Rose Weiler, and I'm an associate professor here at the History Department, and I'd like to welcome you this evening to this year's installment of the Pauley Lecture on Global Affairs. Before I go any further, I want to, first of all, say a few words of thanks. Thank you very much to History Department staff members, Ms. Jessie Olam and Ms. Amira Bacchus, both of whom are responsible for organizing tonight. It wouldn't have happened without them. So this annual lecture is really the highlight of our spring semester, and I'd like to take a few moments before we get to the lecture to recognize some scholarship and grant winners. Each year we offer 1 or 2 scholarships in honor of Thomas Greenhall. And so this year the winners are graduate student Andrew Kashuni and undergraduate Sebastian Delgado. Neither of them are here tonight. If you're here, they're not here. Okay. We also offer a scholarship in memory of Richmond Barge, and this year's winner is undergraduate Marina Montes Colon. Is she here this evening? Okay. So let's congratulate her. And then I just learned, and he is here tonight, I just learned that undergraduate Sebastian Garcia was one of a group of students, but I think the only history major, who won an undergraduate research award for the documentary film Jewel of Paramore, The Wells-Built Hotel. So congratulations. And of course, we also have the Middle Eastern Studies program that offers the Mary Flay McCool Scholarship for Middle Eastern Studies. And this year's winner there is Yanain Yamut. So let's congratulate. I would also like to take time to recognize the winners of the Pauley Travel Awards, which fund travel for international research and professional development. And those awards go to faculty members in the History Department. This year's Travel Award winners are Dr. Wayne Bowen, who is here, and he will be traveling to Istanbul, Turkey, to conduct research at the American Research Institute and to present his work Uneasy Allies, the Knights of Malta, and the Spanish Habsburgs from 1530 to 1701 at the 3rd International Conference on the Military History of the Mediterranean Sea. And our other Pauley Travel Award winner is Dr. Rashisha Narayan, I'm so sorry, Rashisha, who is going to be traveling to Singapore this coming June to present her work, Sacred Bodies and Rituals of Protest, Caste, Early Colonial Law, and Agrarian Economy in Northern India. And she'll be doing that at the Cultural Histories of Empire Conference, organized by the International Society for Cultural History. So let's congratulate her. And now on to tonight's event. So tonight's lecture marks the 16th installment of the Pauley Speaker Series on Global Affairs, which has been made possible by the generosity of Bruce and Marianne Pauley. Professor Bruce Pauley is a professor emeritus of the History Department. He taught German and Austrian and modern European history at UCF for 35 years, and his teaching and research focused on anti-Semitism and Nazism. In recognition of this work, he was awarded the Austrian Cross of Honor for Letters and Arts, and last year he received an alumni award from Grinnell College, recognizing him as someone who embodies Grinnell College's mission of lifetime learning and service. His generosity and his commitment to intellectual pursuits is what has made tonight's lecture possible. I would also like to acknowledge and thank this year's Pauley Lecture Committee. Dr. Amelia Lyons, Dr. Kenneth Hansen, Dr. Hakan Azulu, and Dr. Eric Rutko, who I saw here somewhere. So thank you all very much. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Amelia Lyons, who will introduce our speaker.
Good evening. Thank you for everyone for being here. I want to thank our staff again for all of the incredibly hard work that they do every day in our department and to make events like this possible. And I want to thank my colleagues for the work that they do and for all of you for being here this evening. Jennifer Palmer, it's really my honor to introduce her. She is my colleague and my friend, and of course she is Associate Professor of History at the University of Georgia. She received her PhD in 2008 from the University of Michigan and is the recipient of numerous, in fact too many to list all of her fellowships, awards, and honors here. So I'm just going to mention a few. An NEH grant, an Omohundra Institute grant, and a Chateaubriand Fellowship. She is the author of, and you know, because my students know I always play Van White and show the book when we're talking about it. She's the author of Intimate Bonds, Family and Slavery in the French Atlantic from the University of Pennsylvania Press 2016, and the 2017 winner of the Mary Alice and Philip Boucher Book Prize from the French Colonial Historical Society, of which she's also a past president. She is also the author of numerous articles and book chapters, and I'm going to mention 3 of them specifically because they draw on her current research, and so these are places where you can go for more than from this evening. In 2019, in French history, she published The Fruits of Their Labors, Race, Gender, and Land Ownership in 18th Century French Empire. In 2020, she published She Persisted in Her Revolt, Mediating Slavery and Freedom in Saint-Domingue in Histoire Sociale, Social History in 2020, for which she received that year's prize for the best article in the journal. And then most recently in 2021, in the journal Lumière, Histoire, Littérature et Philosophie, she published Quotidian Intimacy, Gender and Slavery in 18th Century La Rochelle. I also want to add tonight, because I think this makes this visit extra special, that Jennifer is from Orlando. She grew up in Orlando. She went to Winter Park High School. Oh. She is a daughter of Orlando who has gone on to all of these great things. And I can't help but also, who I met briefly last night, introduce her mother, Mary Palmer, who is in the audience. Generation of women faculty at UCF, who we need to celebrate, especially this month. That we're all here. If I'm not wrong, she was the first woman dean at UCF? And I think second. And she continues as well to contribute to our community, volunteering on the Shakes board, the OPO board, probably others that I'm not even aware of. And so I think, right, this also means that Dr. Jennifer Palmer, who's speaking tonight, she grew up in Orlando and she grew up on this campus, right? She knows more folks here that have worked on this campus than probably I do, and I've been teaching here for 16 years. So she knows this campus a little bit like my children do, as a place where, right, all of her parents' friends were, and where she got to kind of grow up and be in this milieu. And I think that's pretty tremendous. She also, I think, is the first person to give both the Pauley Annual Lecture in our department and the James Weldon Johnson Lecture in Africana Studies. So one more, and you know, if we could get her to do some Florida history, we'd have a trifecta. We'd have to figure out what the EGOT version of this. She would be our first. This evening, Dr. Palmer's lecture addresses the roles of that race and gender played in property ownership as the economy of the Atlantic world shifted towards plantation capitalism in the late 17th and 18th centuries. Focusing on the French Caribbean, she'll explore how 3 different women of color claimed and eventually lost ownership over different types of property, including privilege, land, and their own bodies. Thank you, Dr. Palmer, for coming here tonight and for helping us to learn.
It's true, I am that very rare commodity, an Orlando native. Scarcely seen outside of Orlando, but it's true. I did grow up kind kind of on this campus and in the city, and so it is a particular delight to be here today, especially with such a wonderful mix of people from the community, from the university, faculty, students, and so thank you for having me. Thank you to the Pauley Committee, to Dr. Lyons, to Amira, and to Jesse, and to the Pauley family. I'm really, really happy to be here. So, I want to start with an archive story. Historians love to tell stories about their visits to the archives. So when I was beginning to think about my current book project, which, as Dr. Lyons said, is on race, gender, and property in the early modern French Atlantic world, I started my initial research at the French National Archives in Paris. Here we go. I was interested in women who owned property, and so I wanted to look at notary records. Notaries functioned kind of like we would think of lawyers, and so if you bought or sold a piece of property, you went to a notary, right? If you made a will, you went to a notary. If you needed a lease drawn up, you, say it with me, you went to a notary. Okay, good, you got it. So all of these notary contracts were filed with the crown, with the king's archives, and they are preserved in the archives today. All 20 million pages of them. And so I was sure that in this repository I would find evidence of women as property owners. However, these documents are notoriously difficult to use because they're organized not by name, or by date, or by geography, but rather by notary. And so in order to request specific documents, you need to go like over here, and you need to look up the name of the notary, and then you find a reference number on the computer, then you go over here where there's a little black notebook, and you find a corresponding number in the little black notebook, then you go back to this room, and you enter the number in a computer, and you find the code of the document, and then you go to a different computer, and you enter the code. So it's a very complicated process. I didn't know how to do it, and I wanted a little orientation. So I asked the archivist if she would, explain to me how this is done. What are you researching? She asked, not unreasonably. Women who owned property in the 18th century, I answered, also not unreasonably. Women could not own property in the old regime, she responded. You will find nothing in the notary records. This firmly held conviction that women did not own property in France during the old regime, and so before the French Revolution began in 1789, this puzzled me. Where did it come from? There's a strong historiographic tradition in French history that holds that the French Revolution changed, just about everything is what this tradition says, but most particularly property ownership. Before the revolution, this line of thinking goes, people could hold property in different and, it is strongly implied, unnecessarily complicated ways. Peasants worked property which was claimed by feudal lords. All of it ultimately belonged to the king, and they all exercised different sorts of ownership over this property. Furthermore, what people considered property also was different. You could have clothes or books or livestock or land, but you could also own titles and other forms of privilege that were endowed by the king. The French Revolution, so this thinking goes, simplified what ownership meant, ushering in a modern age where a single owner can use paperwork to prove his, or, okay, maybe in the last 50 years, her ownership. So we could debate whether or not ownership now is actually simple. Do you own your house, or does the bank that holds the mortgage? Is your apartment really yours? Is this my pen if I just found it on the podium? But this exchange got me thinking. Hold on, I need to remember how to make this go black. Okay, Jess is on it. Thank you. So this exchange with the archivist got me thinking about what exactly it means to own something, how we know who owns what, and if there's a difference in the letter of the law and how people understand and practice ownership on an everyday basis. And so think about the apartment that you rent, or the car that you lease, or the jacket that you borrow from your roommate and just never give back. it also got me thinking about if who is doing the owning affects how something is owned. So turning back to our friend the archivist, I already knew from my previous research that women did own property. I have found lots of examples of women as owners of many different types of property as I researched my first book. So for that research, I focused on families who lived in La Rochelle on the Atlantic coast of France, so right about there, and also in France's colony Saint-Domingue, which is now Haiti. And so both of these places, they were very oriented towards the Caribbean economy. So this got me wondering, could there be something particular about the colonial Caribbean that allowed women to own property in ways that they couldn't in France? As it turns out, the answer is yes. In particular, women of color owned land and businesses at especially high rates in the 1770s and 1780s, which is when archival holdings for colonial notary records, contracts, really begins. So this suggested to me that any research on gender and property needed to begin in the Caribbean, and that race had to be a crucial consideration as well. So what happens to our understanding of property ownership if we center our investigation on women of color in the Caribbean instead of white men in France? By centering a place that seems marginal and people who seem peripheral in French history, in Atlantic history, in world history, it gives us a new answer to our starting question, could women own property? It gives us some other new answers too. It also makes us rethink the relationship between colony and metropole or mother country. It causes us to question the origins of a modern legalistic model of ownership. And it even prompts us to take another look at the meaning of the right to property as enshrined alongside life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If we change our frame in this way, we see the shift in property and ownership very differently. It's not about the French Revolution at all. Instead, it's about the emergence and institutionalization of white privilege in the context of colonial plantation capitalism. So for the rest of the talk, we're going to turn our attention to the cases of Madeleine Berne, Nanon, and Artois, three women of color who have never drawn much attention from historians, who lived in Martinique, which is in the south here, and Guadeloupe, the island in the north. These small islands were claimed and settled by the French in the early 17th century, but they're often overlooked by historians who tend to focus on the sugar giant and future revolutionary hotbed of Saint-Domingue. We're also going to focus on the late 17th and early 18th century up to about 1730. This is often a neglected period, primarily because there's a much larger archival record for the period after 1760. So remember our archivist. But when we focus on the earlier period, what we see is an empire that's very much in flux. France is still feeling its way towards what it meant to be a colonial power, and systems of domination along lines of race and class that later seemed so entrenched as to be inevitable are still in the process of being developed. So we're looking in the margins of history. We're looking at people who no one has really ever been very interested in places that haven't drawn very much attention, and at a time that not much has been written about. And this, I think, is exactly what makes it interesting. Looking at the fringes of identity, of empire, and even of archival records allow us to examine how women own property, and also how their opportunities to own disappear. Now, I want to just note that I will use language today that might be considered offensive. I'm going to use these words only in quotations, and I will keep them in the original French. I decided to do that rather than translate them into words that are potentially less offensive, because the French meanings of the words are more capacious. They can mean more than the English translations, and I thought that that was important to preserve. So the word nègre in French can mean the color black. It can also mean black person, but it can also mean enslaved person. Mulâtre can mean person of mixed race, but it also can mean free person of color, and person of color was the contemporary term. It's what they used in the 18th century. And so the important thing to remember here is that these words can indicate race or phenotype, but they don't necessarily do so. They're also about enslaved or free status. Okay, so let's turn our attention to Martinique and the case of Madeleine Baron. When Madeleine Baron was born in the village of Carbet around 1657, Martinique was well on its way to becoming a plantation economy. By 1700, Martinique had a population of about 21,600 souls. Here we see the entire population, about 7,000 free, and about 14,500 enslaved. And so the 7,000 free include white people or people for whom no race is indicated in the records, which could include white people or free people of color, and also free people of color. And the category of free white people also would include white indentured servants. So Martinique was the largest sugar producer in the French Empire until it was surpassed by Saint-Domingue in about 1720, and it was an important source of revenue for a cash-strapped king. And Louis XIV was looking everywhere for money. By 1700, he was coming off a series of ruinously expensive wars, with another coming right up, and he had just finished building Versailles, and let me tell you, halls of mirrors do not come cheap. In a desperate effort to pay his bills, he was selling noble titles to anyone with cash, and he was looking for new tax revenue everywhere he could. Good, I got it now. Okay, now this effort was impeded by the fact that in France, taxation and privilege were very tightly bound together. The king bestowed exemptions from taxation as a mark of his favor. For the most part, nobles didn't pay taxes, and neither did the clergy or certain other individuals and groups who the king smiled upon. Exemption thus indicated social and cultural status, and in this society, where the wealthy middle class strove above all things to purchase nobility, status was an asset. It could literally be bought, sold, and inherited. So, on the one hand, the king had lone control over who had access to privilege. On the other hand, because privilege included tax exemptions, and those who did not pay taxes were often the wealthiest, the liberal dispensation of privilege actually decreased cash flow into the royal treasury in the long term. Oh, geez, I'm sorry, I did it again, Jesse. Okay, so this meant that the king was actively seeking ways to increase the tax base. And this proved remarkably difficult to do, and he tried. At least it was difficult in France. However, the Caribbean was something of a blank slate when it came to taxation. Even by the end of the 17th century, when debt from foreign wars was crushing the French treasury, it wasn't clear how or even whether the king would tax his Caribbean subjects. The issue was that Louis XIV had two basic and related goals when it came to the Caribbean: to promote permanent settlement and to promote the cultivation of cash crops. And he absolutely planned to tax the cash crops by import and export duties. When it came to promoting permanent settlement, tax exemptions could provide a powerful incentive in urging people to colonize the Caribbean, thus beginning the process of social and biological reproduction that would make the islands a powerhouse of empire. This meant incentivizing permanent settlement and marriage for women as well as for men. So in accordance with this plan, colonists were a privileged group in that they were exempt from much of the taxation that plagued their French counterparts. They paid no tithe, which was a land tax, no gabelle, a salt tax, no tithes, which went to the Catholic Church, and no inheritance tax. However, there was one tax that they did pay. A tax that in the beginning only applied in the French Caribbean, the capitation or the head tax. In theory, the capitation was levied on every single colonial resident, no matter what their race, gender, or social status. This particularly reviled tax was extended to all of France by Louis XIV in 1695, but only after its successful rollout in the French Caribbean starting in the 1620s. Meaning that this type of taxation grew and expanded alongside colonialism. The Antilles kind of provided a laboratory here, a place to experiment with a template that was later applied in France. So, from 1665, the Crown imposed a standardized head tax on all residents of French Caribbean territories. But of course, course, some people received tax exemptions. Many of these fell along well-worn lines that were very familiar in France. All nobles received tax exemptions, and all clergy, you'd think that Louis would have learned his lesson, as did men in direct service of the king, and like royal officials or judges. Depending on their rank, they usually received an exemption for themselves and a certain number of enslaved people. Otherwise, colonists had to pay taxes for all of their dependents, including their families, their indentured servants, and those they enslaved. So this leads us to the key question of how to deploy exemptions to the capitation in a way that would best support the crown's goals. Using tax exemption to promote the cultivation of cash crops was a pretty easy solution, although it did lead to using exemptions differently from in France because they were given as a temporary measure rather than a permanent exemption. And so, for example, if you built a new sugar refinery, you got an exemption. If there was a cocoa blight and your cocoa crop got wiped out, you got an exemption. If your cash crops were destroyed by a hurricane, something you all are familiar with, okay, now say it with me again, you got an exemption. These exemptions helped to promote a certain type of economy that was profitable for the crown, an economy that was based in slave labor and in cash crops. However, the question of how to promote permanent settlement was a little bit harder. Tax exemptions can help here too, but the question was who to grant them to and on what basis. They started by promoting the creation of families. Starting in 1665, any men who got married would receive a complete exemption for the first year and an 80% reduction thereafter, so a pretty hefty tax cut. As women were instrumental in the creation and social reproduction of families, exemptions also were extended to all white women and girls and to, quote, white children born in the islands as well as their descendants in order to distinguish between the natives of this country and others. And so race at this early date played a crucial role in who had to pay taxes and who was exempt. But the problem was they really, really needed those settlers. And the French crown, in any case, had never really been given to promoting visions of racial purity, and race itself wasn't a developed concept at this time. Instead, the crown was more concerned with promoting Catholic marriage. People's race didn't really matter as long as they were having sexual relations and families within the bounds of marriage. So, maybe in recognition of the demographic reality that there were few white women and many interracial sexual relationships, the next iteration of legislation on taxation, just a few years later, left out that crucial word, white. Instead, it extended exemptions to, quote, male and female Creoles native of the islands. And in the French Caribbean, a Creole is not someone of mixed race, as we might think of it in the US, but rather someone who was born in the Caribbean versus in France. So this meant that free people of color born in the French Antilles were also eligible for tax exemptions. Enter Madeleine Baron. She had been born free in Martinique, and what's more, she was a woman. And through this same 1671 ordinance, all free women were exempt. Remember that goal of promoting permanent settlement. So she had the privilege of a tax exemption. And this privilege seemed secure until the king needed more money. In 1696, France was embroiled in the 9 Years' War against, you can see, basically everyone else in Europe. And tax collectors and royal officials were under pressure to squeeze every last sou that they could out of their districts. So in the Caribbean, they reviewed the tax rolls to make sure everyone who was receiving an exemption actually deserved one. Madeleine Baron, the official decided, should indeed have her privilege of exemption. However, there must have been some kind of irregularity because he also wrote to his superiors in Versailles asking for their confirmation of his decision. They resoundingly endorsed it, referring to the 1685 Code Noir, the legal code that governed the conditions and practices of slavery in the French Caribbean. Now, as she had been born free, the Code Noir never technically applied to Madeleine Baron. However, It did address the transition from enslavement to freedom, and it took a remarkably expansive view that slavery was a temporary state, and once it ended, the formerly enslaved had no legal disabilities. You can contrast that in your mind, for example, to the Jim Crow system in the United States, where formerly enslaved people and their descendants faced considerable legal disabilities. All free people, therefore, would be granted, quote, the same rights, privileges, and immunities which people born free enjoy. As for Madeleine Baird, the Crown clarified, quote, His Majesty intends that regarding the obligations of the capitation, free nègres of both sexes, and also free mulâtres and mulâtresses, will be treated only in their own person, like other Creoles, and that they will be, for these purposes, included in the effects of the legislation of 1671. So Creole-born free people of color did not have to pay the capitation tax, and the Crown confirmed this decision again just 1 month later. So I just want to take a moment to point out the slippage that's going on here between free people of color, including Madeleine Baird, who had been born free, and freed people of color who had lived some of their lives in slavery before acquiring freedom. By essentially grouping them together here, the Crown starts to erase the very real social and cultural distinctions between these two groups. 16 years later, in 1712, Madeleine Baird's tax exemption came up for review again. The royal tax collector, who got to keep a slice of the taxes that he collected, again tried to tax free people of color. And again, he failed. In fact, he failed pretty spectacularly in that the result even further expanded the demographics of who qualified for exemptions and made exemptions a heritable form of property. Henceforth, not only would anyone, quote, born free have an exemption, freed people would too. Officials in Versailles affirmed, quote, emancipated slaves and Creoles born of free people of color, whether they be nègres or mulâtres, will enjoy the same rights, privileges, and immunities accorded to them that people born free enjoy, both in their persons and in their goods. So it kind of echoes the language of the Code Noir there. They discharged, quote, the said bairn born free from paying any capitation tax, nor her children. Great. So Madeleine Baird was exempt from the tax, her descendants were exempt from the tax, and all other free people of color, whether born free or legally emancipated, also were exempt. On the one hand, this ruling protected the status of free people of color as equal to rights under the law by upholding the Code Noir's provision that all freed people had the same rights as all other French subjects. It also, however, contained the seeds of change. Distinctions among different groups of free people of color gradually dropped out. This decision pointedly grouped together, quote, emancipated slaves and Creoles born of free people of color, whether they be nègres or mulâtres. So, skin tone doesn't matter. Whether or not you had one white parent doesn't matter. If you were born in the Caribbean or France, doesn't matter. And it didn't matter if you were born free or acquired freedom. This formulation seems like a powerful statement of a movement towards racial equality, and perhaps the royal official who wrote it even intended it to be so. However, this promise had one insidious effect. It categorized all free people of color as a uniform group under the law, a group with rights guaranteed by the king, yes, but a group nonetheless. Previously, both legally and socially, the differences among free people of color had trumped their common African ancestry. Afterwards, their classification as people of color mattered more than these differences. So this had the paradoxical and maybe even unintended effect of laying the groundwork for revoking their access to privileges available to all French subjects, including the exemption to the capitation. By the 1720s, royal officials once again sought to tax free people of color. This time, proponents of their taxation employed the rhetoric of fairness, arguing that extending the privilege of exemption to Creole-born free people of color was unfair to whites. And this is a rhetoric that we still hear today in criticisms of affirmative action. One Crown official wrote, quote, "Free people of color have in their favor nothing to justify their exemption, but the reason of being Creoles for the most part." Remember, that means they're born in the colony. Another official, whose name isn't important, another official on the contrary says that he is shocked that the Negre enjoy such a privilege when foreign whites do not enjoy it, that this practice maintains their pride, and that it would be in good order to not give such exemptions to these slaves in origin. So this indicates the completion of the shift towards viewing free people of color as a single group. By presenting all of them as, quote, slaves in origin, the official both grouped free people of color with the enslaved and separated them from whites, erasing all cross-racial similarities based on common history, shared culture, family, or birthplace, and emphasizing only differences between free people of color and whites. Madeline Bairn's case came up for review one last time in 1724. This time by the Conseil du Roi, or the King's Council. And as the King's personal advisory council, this was the court of last resort for the entire empire. And one of its roles was making sure that laws were correctly interpreted and applied. Their ruling dramatically reversed nearly 4 decades of decisions that had prioritized the equality promised by the Code Noir to free people of color. Thereafter, quote, "all nègres and négresses, mulâtres and mulâtresses, emancipated or born free in the Windward Islands of America, whether they be Creoles or no, will be subject to the capitation tax." After this, free people of color as a group had to pay the capitation. Neither individually nor as a group could they receive the privilege of exemption. This ultimate denial of Madeline Bairn's exemption from the capitation marked a turning point for free people of color. For the first time, they were explicitly excluded from privilege because of their perceived common identity, and whites were allowed access to it because of theirs. Tax exemptions became a form of white privilege, while for people enslaved, formerly enslaved, or free, blackness became a legal liability. Let's shift our focus now to Guadeloupe. We're looking at this part right down here, where lived 2 free women of color named Nanon and Artois. I know nothing about them, or next to nothing about them, and that's in contrast to Madeline Bairn, who I've been able to find quite a lot about, so we can talk about why that might be if you want to later. But I suspect that they have been enslaved, either born into slavery or brought as captives from Africa. And I suspect this for 2 reasons. One is their virtual absence from archival records. Normally, the lives of free people left archival traces. We can usually find, at the very least, records of what we might call their vital statistics, when and where they were born, who their parents were, when and who they married, if they had children, when they died. If we're lucky, we might find out a bit more, like maybe some business records or a will, or if they got into trouble with the law. So normally, the lives of free people had points of contact with the state or related institutions that it's possible to trace. Nanon and Artois did not. The second reason is their names. Only their first names are ever given, and these names are evocative of enslavement. Nanon, a diminutive of Anne, enslaved people were often called by diminutives. And Artois, possibly after the French region, possibly after the powerful family that were its rulers. French slaveholders often named the enslaved after their home regions in France, or, in a horrible irony, after powerful people. But although we suspect Nanon and Artois came from the humblest of origins, by the time our story begins in 1722, they had resources. Not money, not power, but some kind of standing and respect in their community, or a reputation for being trustworthy, because a white widow, the widow Maniel, agreed to allow them to farm her land. Now, let's think about why the white widow might have agreed to this, because it doesn't seem as if she charged them rent. The land in question was situated on the slopes of La Grande Soufflière, an active volcano and the highest mountain in the Caribbean. This meant that the elevation was high and the soil was rocky and acidic, not good for growing sugar, which thrived on coastal lowland plains. So it was kind of considered wasteland. Ideals about white femininity made it unlikely that the widow would perform the labor of farming herself, and yet she needed the land cleared and cultivated. The king had issued a series of edicts, and these are really just a very few of the edicts that he issued, mandating that any colonial land allotted as a concession or a type of land grant that was given by the crown had to be cleared and put under cultivation within 6 years. And so for the widow, the clock was ticking. At the same time, there were some larger shifts going on in the Caribbean that changed the value of land and labor. First, the rise of Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, as an extremely profitable sugar producer meant that pretty much every French slave trader set their course for Saint-Domingue. And so what we see here is the volume of slave ships coming to the French colonies. You see the large arrow going to Saint-Domingue. The smaller arrow with the number 3, that is Martinique, Guadeloupe, and a group of enslaved people whose destinations are unknown. And then this is French Guiana here, just a tiny volume. And here we can see this in a different way. The number of enslaved people whose ultimate destination was Saint-Domingue, Martinique in the red, Guadeloupe in the gray, and then unknown is in yellow here. So what this means for us is that Guadeloupe's labor supply basically consisted of people who already lived there, because that's not where ships were coming to sell enslaved people. So the widow might not have been able to purchase enslaved laborers to clear and farm the land for her, even if she wanted to and could afford to. Second, one effect of the sugar boom was a demand for land such as the crown had never seen before. It was essentially a real estate bubble. We all know how it goes, right? This resulted in a rush on land concessions and an intensification of crown efforts to ensure that all land was put under cultivation, preferably growing cash crops, pretty much immediately. If it wasn't, the crown took back the land that it had granted and gave it to someone else. So we can think about who gets pushed out when real estate suddenly becomes valuable. One side effect of this demand for land was that it became increasingly important to demonstrate proof of landholding through paperwork, such as concession deeds or notary contracts. Verbal agreements, like the one made by Nanon, Artois, and the widow, had been fairly common. However, as the competition for land grew, written contracts prepared by notaries or paperwork authorized by colonial officials increasingly replaced these informal forms of land transfer. Third was the introduction of coffee. One colonial administrator regarded, quote, the culture of coffee as the source of considerable fortune because this plant thrives extremely well in all sorts of lands, and it produces abundantly. And the small planters who are the foundation of the islands can undertake it with only 1 or 2 slaves. Coffee in particular thrived in rocky, acidic soil at high elevations. This made the terrain that had before seemed unusable to French migrants, such as the foothills of La Grande Soufrière, seem very attractive indeed. And you can see here, this is a Google map that shows elevation. Whoops. And so you can kind of see that here is where they lived, and this is already hilly leading up to the volcano. So from 1722 to 1727, Nanon and Artois cleared, planted, and farmed their land. There's no record of what they grew, but they likely planted it with foodstuffs. In Guadeloupe and in the Caribbean as a whole, free people of color grew most of the subsistence crops, and women of color dominated the marketplaces. And so it's not a stretch to think that Nanon and Artois grew plantains, yams, or manioc, or perhaps even exotic imports from France like artichokes or asparagus. They might have sold these fruits of their labors in a nearby town. They built a small hut, a kitchen, and a hen house, and these, along with their crops, clearly indicate that they had possession of the land, and they were eking a precarious living out of it. In 1727, almost precisely 6 years after she had given it to Nanon and Artois, the widow decided to sell the land. Remember that significance of that 6-year period? The crown said you had to get the land under cultivation within that time, or they would confiscate it. So for Nano and Artois, this decision spelled disaster. All of a sudden, in spite of the long, grueling days, the sweat and aching muscles they had poured into the land, they stood to lose any living they had established. Their own claim to the land, the reason that they had worked it in the first place, was based on a verbal agreement. Was there anything they could do to protect their claim? The buyer, Pierre Dumouchel, seemed very eager to acquire the land. So eager, in fact, that he was willing to purchase it, quote, without guarantee. This seems like a hint to me that he saw its potential for cash crop cultivation. But to ensure his success, Mouchel went about staking his claim in multiple ways that speak to his understanding of how the ways of establishing ownership were changing and his ability to use this knowledge to his advantage. At the same time he sought to buy the land, he also applied for and was granted a concession from the governor and the intendant of the Windward Isles, so the highest colonial officials, guaranteeing his claim to the property. He also obtained an order from a lesser colonial official that commanded Nanon and Artois to vacate their lot. So he thereby approached this process of establishing his ownership from the top, positioning colonial administrators as its arbiters, and of course that fit very well with their own agenda. Yet, one of the most important things that we learn from this case is that ownership over land was not always established from above. It was also constructed from below. In fact, it offers us a glimpse into an entirely different system of ownership, one that historians can't often access because it was based on informal verbal agreements that disappeared with their makers, rather than formal legal documents that made their way into the archives. Furthermore, this informal system was open to the participation of women and free people of color, and it didn't have to be this way. With the continuing practice of redlining, for example, often in-person interactions are disadvantageous for people of color. And the same sometimes goes for white women. And so here, actually now, is a map of Orlando in 2018 that details housing based on racial demographics. So what this suggests is an understanding of landholding where it was possible for one person to transfer authority over a piece of land to another, and for that kind of handshake agreement to be accepted and respected by all parties involved and by others in the community. Possession here maybe was 9/10 of the law, or at the very least, it was a powerful indicator of ownership. This system was so widely recognized that it was even acknowledged by the Crown. Louis XIV's order of the 12th of October of 1683 established that, quote, the portion of lands that will have been cleared and cultivated in the said French islands of America will belong incontestably to those of the residents who have done the clearing. I'm going to repeat this because I think it is really important. The portion of lands that will have been cleared and cultivated in the said French islands of America will belong incontestably to those of the residents who will have done the clearing. Further, the labor of those who cleared and worked the land privileged their claim over those who had simply obtained either, quote, older or newer concessions. So thinking about this framework allows us to interpret this case as way more than a simple conflict over property. Rather, it was a clash of two systems of ownership. An older, informal system that relied on verbal agreements, a level of trust between the parties, and the backing and consensus of the community, which had to agree that the property did in fact have a new owner. White women and free people of color could participate in this system. As long as they could find someone to enter into transactions with them, there were no formal limits. There might have been some informal limits, and if you want to, we can pick that up in the Q&A. As written authorization became more important, concession deeds, notary contracts, who had access to procuring these documents was much more circumscribed. You had to have deep knowledge of colonial laws and the legal system, geographic access to a notary and the money to pay him, and preferably a level of literacy, especially if you were applying for concessions from colonial officials. Mouchel, the buyer, had all of these things. Nanon and Artois did not. Over the course of this systemic shift, no laws ever formally barred white women or free people of color from owning property. Yet the emerging emphasis on documentary proof favored white men all the same. The buyer, Mouchel, used his knowledge of the royal administrative system to orchestrate a survey of the property, which would determine who had the stronger claim to own the land. In a judgment of the 3rd of December, 1728, colonial officials awarded it to the white colonist based on the concession he had received from the governor and the purchase he had made from the widow. Nanon and Artois were told to vacate the premises within 3 months and to pay the expenses of the case. In recognition that their labor had produced value, they were permitted to take all ripe produce with them and to remove their hut if they wanted to. So this spelled disaster for Nanon and Artois. With the stroke of a pen, 6 years of time, investment, planning, and difficult labor disappeared, along with their livelihood. Their last hope was to appeal the case to the King's Council, as had Madeleine Baird. Their appeal claimed that the initial judgment, quote, was rendered by an incompetent judge. I mean, who could argue with that, right? And they asked that the lower official's decision be dismissed. They also invoked this law of the 12th of October of 1683, which prioritized the claims of those who worked the land over those who did not, even if they held concessions to it. So their case rested on their labor. Because they had cleared and worked the land, they argued, they could not be dispossessed of it. Let's take a step back to consider the implications of this. Implications which were grounded in this edict made by the king himself. In a colonial context, what would happen if working the land gave people ownership over it? What of the vast plantations where enslaved people produced cash crops, or even the small plots of land where owners allowed enslaved people to grow their own provisions? In an empire where the economy was built on unfree labor of varying kinds, including serfdom, indentured servitude, and slavery, any ruling that determined that ownership over land could be claimed through labor would open up a revolutionary can of worms. The King's Council listed the only thing that they could do. They made no ruling and sent it back to colonial officials to make a final decision. A decision that would bear on this particular case, but no other. If the King's Council made a decision, on the other hand, it would apply to the entire empire. They must have known what would happen next. While there's no record of the ultimate outcome of this case, any decision by local officials certainly would not be favorable to Nanon and Artois. Henceforth, opportunities to exert or transfer ownership in informal, community-sanctioned ways increasingly disappeared. What replaced them was methods of ownership defined, controlled, and recorded by the French state, methods that favored those who best understood the workings of the colonial administrative and legal systems, that is, white men. So let's revisit our friend, the archivist. She thought she knew what property meant, basically land transfers that were recorded in the archives. And she thought she knew how people established ownership over it through contracts and deeds that were recorded in the archives. And but had she known about Madeleine Baird, she might have thought about property more expansively, as including privilege and non-tangible things, such as tax exemptions. Had she known about Nanon and Artois, she might have realized that people could make claims to ownership in ways beyond contracts. The archivist knew what was in the archives, and that shaped her understanding of our initial question about women's property ownership. But we've seen what happens when we shift our view to look at not what's central, and of course contracts are central to property ownership, but rather to focus on what's marginal. We instead examine the fringes, the periphery of empire, the least expected of property owners, and even archival collections that don't initially seem to contain answers to the questions that we're asking. But doing this opens up a much richer world to us. centralizing the stories of Madeleine Baird, Nanon, and Artois helps us to understand that women did own property, and that the way people own property changed over time, away from personal agreements and community consensus towards a legalistic reliance on contracts and paperwork, all of which in this society were produced by white men. And that's one reason why women and free people of color are so often invisible in archives, because archives also were produced and created and maintained for and by white men. So if we want to reveal and understand longer-term legal shifts that made it increasingly difficult for certain populations to assert ownership, we need to look at what might initially appear to be peripheral spaces and at marginal populations. I would argue that modern property holding emerged in a colonial context in the wake of the cases of Madeleine Baird, Nanon, and Artois, not, as so many have argued, in the wake of the French Revolution, and that modern property holding was racialized and gendered from the beginning. This is really important because at the very same time, Enlightenment ideas that form the basis for the foundational documents of modern nation states were taking root. The right to life, the right to liberty, the right to property. But who has these rights? Whose ownership is accepted? And who gets questioned about whether what they own is actually theirs? Who is already viewed as a legitimate property holder? Who is suspect? And how is that racialized and gendered? Focusing on the cases of Madeleine Baird, Nanon, and Artois gives us a different view of who can own property and how they could assert their ownership and how those opportunities disappear. Thank you. We have some time for questions and conversation. Great. Yes.
Did they use colonial lawyers for their cases, or did they have did they have lawyers for these cases?
Oh, that's a good question. Did they have lawyers for these cases or not? So lawyers were actually not allowed in the French Caribbean until about 1710. And so after 1710, they could use lawyers for these cases. Before 1710, they could not. But basically, yes, they did use lawyers for the cases. Yeah. Good, that's a good question about the mechanics.
Why were lawyers not?
Were they the sharks? Let me see. I don't know that I have a really good answer for that right now, okay? But I'll get back to you. But they weren't. The Crown did not allow it. Okay, I do have a good answer. The Crown didn't allow lawyers. First in the French Caribbean, and then that prohibition lasted longer in New Orleans, actually. And they didn't allow the lawyers because they wanted to really maintain authority. In colonial spaces, there were opportunities for the Crown to assert authority in less complicated ways than in France, where there were, centuries of legal traditions and kind of accrued privileges and different legal systems. And in the colonies, while not totally a blank slate, it was an opportunity for the Crown to assert its authority and control in a less complicated and more absolute way.
It's a follow-up question.
Yeah, great.
Because as you were talking, I'm sitting here thinking, how did Nanon and Artois even know to use an edict from 40 years prior? Do you have a sense, particularly since lawyers aren't allowed until 1710, is there a sense of a kind of a community network that's allowing people of color to present their cases? How do they get support to be able to do something?
So, yeah, I think the answer to that is absolutely yes. And so one of the things that I found in my research is it is very clear that free people of color and enslaved people also have a real sense of the legal and administrative system and the laws. And so I think that that is definitely part of it. But I think their lawyer probably do too. Yeah. Yes.
The lady who owned the land that Nanon and Artois worked, do you have any record for correspondence? Did she ever mention that?
No, which is typical. It's actually very rare to have correspondence of people who lived in the colonies in the French Caribbean unless they're corresponding with family members in France who were important enough to keep their letters. Yeah. So there's very, very little of kind of just everyday correspondence. Yes.
What about the material conditions and assumptions colonial officials were making in 1683 made that proclamation useful for colonization and not like a pretty radical statement or ancestry?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting shift, isn't it? And so you are getting there, I think, the point that I'm trying to make about how colonial conditions are shifting and how the Crown is starting to exercise its authority in new ways as they're shifting. And so 1683, when that proclamation was made, the conditions are very, very different than 20 years later, and so they have to roll things back. But I think that it's significant that the direction they decide to roll them back is by making it harder for certain groups of people to own things. Yeah.
In the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, 1500s and 1600s, there was a distinction because women who were either widows or single could own property and could enter into contracts. But once they were married, they couldn't. Is that distinction also in the French-speaking Caribbean?
Yes and no. The French legal system is incredibly complicated in that every region of France has its own legal system. The French Caribbean and the French colonies in general operated under the customary legal system of Paris. And so at least there's one legal system that's operating in the Caribbean, although it takes them a while to figure out, oh, we do actually just need one legal system here. Let's make it ours. Let's make it the one that applies to where the king lives. So women who were married could sometimes own property separately from their husbands. More often would own property jointly with their husbands, and so anything that the couple purchased would be owned by half by each of them. And so one of the things that meant is that the husband was not supposed to sell, alienate in any way the property without his wife's consent. And so many of the notary contracts that I've seen that include women, it's women who are signing them in partnership with their husbands.
When did the notary versus attorney system, when did it start? Was it at the time of the Napoleonic Code, or was it before?
It's before. It's actually way before. And so in France, most of the things that we in the United States would think of attorneys or lawyers as doing, notaries do. And so they do have attorneys and lawyers, but they're more involved in like criminal court cases. More like barristers versus solicitors in the UK, and notaries still in France. If you go to France, you see the notary seal on office doors, and you know the notary works there. And so if you want a legal document drawn up, like a will or a bill of sale or whatever, you go to see the notary.
So the Napoleonic Code basically made the legal system more universal.
Yes, and so one of the effects of the Napoleonic Code was to apply a single legal system to all of France. And I mean, that is kind of a different issue because it's about 100 years after what I'm talking about, but similarly, one of the effects was making it harder for certain types of people to exercise legal rights or control over property. Yes?
I'm just curious, what role does population have to do with some of these decisions? I assume that the population is increasing quite a bit, and so is land becoming more scarce? And
Yes.
we need to sort of cut off who has access to it?
Yes, land is becoming more scarce, especially as it's really becoming clear that the French Caribbean colonies are so economically important. And so with the expansion of the consumption of sugar, and with the expansion of the consumption of other colonial crops, including coffee, land is more and more in demand. And so yes, as the land gets to be more in demand, and as the Crown and the Crown administrators kind of start to figure out how to allocate it and keep track of who owns what, certain people tend to be pushed out. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk, Dr. Pano. As you were talking, I was thinking about the comparisons with the South Asian context. in which many dispossessed widows in particular wrote incessantly, they wrote series of petitions to various colonial officials at different levels, and right up to London itself. They just couldn't go away. And petitioning was a way to demand accountability from the monarch, from the British Crown, and to also assert belonging as subjects of the emerging British Empire. And it starts with fairly early on. That is in the 1760s, 1780s, etc. So I was wondering, do we see, did these women of color use petitions? Do we see similar kinds of documents? And if we don't, then what necessarily is the, can we consider us to, explore why that isn't the case? In the context of these widows in South Asia and various elite and non-elite, they would use intermediaries, people who would, scribes who would write for them, etc. But they found ways to make, to in many ways inscribe themselves into the record.
Yes. And so I think that idea of inscribing yourself into the record is very important. And I've seen evidence of that, but not with petitions. Where I've seen evidence of it is more with parish records, like baptism records, records of the baptism of your children, especially women of color who may or may not be enslaved, really insisting on their presence and the freedom of their children in the context of baptism records, which is really key because baptism records were viewed as proof of freedom. So they're a key, important document, and people know that. In terms of the petitions, I have not seen any from the French Caribbean context. And so my bet is that there were some because there's some really interesting scholarship on petitions in France. Natalie Zeman Davis wrote a great book, about petitioning. But I haven't seen any from the French colonial context, and so I expect there probably were some and they no longer exist. Yeah. And so the sources are that I'm working with here, I primarily royal edicts, laws from the king, which are of course preserved. The correspondence of administrators back and forth from the colonial administrators to their bosses in Versailles, and so of course that's preserved, right? And then these court cases that are petitioned to the Conseil du Roi, the King's Council, and so of course those are preserved. There are other pieces of these cases and other cases that I look at where I look at different types of sources, but these are all very official from above sources here. And one of the things that I'm trying to do is see what we can pull out of them and see what we can learn from these sources that don't seem to speak to the experiences of women of color, and try to see what we can learn anyway. Great.
So you had mentioned that as long as they were within the confines of a church, they were typically allowed. Later, was that changed where if they, besides the race aspect of it, did religion play a bigger role in who could own property?
So it kind of always did. I mean, one of the French crown's justifications for slavery was conversion. And so the French were always a little bit morally uneasy about slavery, and the way they kind of convinced themselves that it was okay was through this kind of justification of, okay, well, we're going to convert all the enslaved people to be Catholic, and then, we're going to save their souls. So from the beginning, from the Code Noir, that 1865 slave code that I showed you, only Catholics were supposed to own enslaved people. It didn't pan out like that. Right? I mean, there were lots of Protestants, actually, and a good number of Jews in the French Caribbean, and anyone could own enslaved people. But technically, according to the Code Noir and the letter of the law, which, as we've already seen, can change, technically only Catholics were supposed to, and that was the reason.
kind of already got into it a bit in the beginning, but I wanted to add, or just see if you could add to it, just kind of the misconceptions that come along with the certain use of terms that you mentioned, like person of color and mulatto. Can you describe like some of the miscommunications that happen when you see people use it in the American sense and not within its French context?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that person of color, one of the things that many Americans think is that it's a contemporary term, like a term we use now, but it actually was also a term they used then, and so I think it's important to make that clear. And also that the terms that they use don't mean just one thing, right? And so, you know, terms can mean, it can just have various definitions and can be deployed differently in different contexts. And so it's important to be sensitive to that, but it makes it tricky to translate, right? Because you can't always really tell exactly what they mean, and they might mean more than one thing, or they might mean just one thing, or they might mean three things, all at the same time. Yeah.
It seems that you have looked at many different other cases too. What made you pick these two cases? How representative are they?
That question of representativity is always an interesting one, because as historians we want things to be representative. And we want to know, you know, what was the experience like for a lot of people. But I think that it's difficult to talk about representativity in the context of plantation societies when you're talking about people of color, whether they're free or enslaved. And I think that it's actually difficult to talk about representativity when you're talking about any marginalized group, including women or peasants or other groups too. And Protestants would be another one. And so one of my goals here is not to really think about what's representative, but rather to think about what's possible, and to think about the boundaries of possibility and expanding our understanding of what could have happened, or what life could have been like in the French Caribbean in the 17th.
Even for marginal groups.
This might not be a question, but I'm working on colonial law in the 19th century, 20th century, so I'm envying your work because, you know, our topic is very about highly regulated, centralized, kind of almost without no exceptions. There's kind of highly tightened control of citizens across the Japanese Empire, but even like French Empire, I think, in relation to French Africa, for example. So I just wonder whether you often receive, from the complex envy from the modernists about law and empire and gender in French, British, or Japanese or whatever. Because this is your case is more. There's so many room for exploring the room for kind of reading through what's left in the document. Rather in our case, it's always there's documentation.
Yeah.
We always tracing through what's there. So just I'm not really questioning, but it's more like I just wonder whether how to receive kind of response from especially modernists, because we tend to think the more modern, much more modern, and the better. But in this case, it's the more regulated, and then it turns out they are dispossessed. Right? So that's kind of my question, curiosity.
Yeah, I love it because it's kind of a question about methodology, right? And I think that there is so much interesting methodology emerging around this question of how do you tell the histories of people whose histories seem untellable. And so it's drawing on Michel Rolf-Trouillot, how do you talk about this unthinkable history? This history that has purposefully been excluded from archives. And in some instances, it is very purposeful. There are hints that in the French Caribbean, any colonial records pertaining to enslaved people were systematically burned over the course of the 18th century. And so they're purposefully destroying that part of that record of their history. And so there's so much great, interesting, vibrant scholarship now on thinking about how to tell those stories anyway, based on what we have and what we can imagine. And so we can think about scholars such as Cynthia Hartman and Jennifer Morgan, Marissa Fuentes, Sasha Turner, people who are really trying to think, Ann Stoller, I mean, people who are really trying to think about how to expand the historian's toolbox and how to really work to come up with new methods and new ways of seeing the past. And so, I mean, that's what I try to do. Yeah.
When they ship like the notary document, or like, do they make two different copies of it and then ship one, the original to the archive or to mainland France and keep the copy in the Caribbean as well?
Yes, and so this is another really good, like, how does this work question. So yes, that is exactly what they did. And so in the colonial officials would write their letters to Versailles, and in Versailles they would keep a copy of their letters that they sent to the colonies and the letters that were sent back. And so they're both sides of the correspondence that were recorded in Paris. I imagine at one point both sides of the correspondence were also recorded in the Caribbean, but those versions don't exist anymore. Same with the notary records, those official records, and the parish records, which were kept by the Catholic Church. After a certain time, for the notary records, it was the 1770s, there was a law that said, okay, notaries, you have to copy every single contract you make and send a copy to us. And so the notaries kept one copy, and then they sent a copy to France. And so those copies that were sent are the ones that still exist. Yeah. Great. Yes?
Sorry. Was that more informal system of like land ownership in any way connected to maroon communities, or even in early period they completely separate and demonized by the French colonists?
So that is a really interesting question, because of course there were maroon communities everywhere, right? And especially in those mountainous regions. And in the records of the correspondence about concessions that I looked at, one of their concerns is that the French colonists who are granted the concessions need to really firmly establish possession of their land, partly to drive out the Maroons, right? And so there was one comment that I found where the official says, oh yes, you should definitely grant the concession to him because he will be very good at controlling the Maroons. And so yes, that is absolutely part of it. Yeah, the idea of controlling the land and making it French. Great, any final questions?
I want to thank Dr. Palmer again for coming. We're also so pleased after so many years of doing these kinds of things in digital spaces to have a really great turnout here in person. So thank you for coming this evening as well, and have a great evening.
Thank you.